Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As some of you might already know, Art Forward is an art and tech startup. So this festival would have been very incomplete without at least one conversation about the transforming role of technology in art. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this masterclass today. Thank you so much, Harshit, for joining us. Harshit will be exploring today what he calls the human machine creative continuum in art and how he, the cyborg artist, uses machines, algorithms, and augmented reality technologies in his artistic process. We will also be exploring the interaction of technology with art and how technology is going to be used to transform the arts moving forward. Just before we begin, a little bit about Harshit. Harshit Agrawal is an artificial intelligence and new media artist exploring the melding of human and machine creative agency. He was the only Indian artist among 7 pioneers in the world's first AI show at Nature Mort. India's first AI show at Nature Mort. His work has been extensively covered in international media, including BBC, New York Times, as one of the founding artists of the AI art genre. And now I give this over to Harshit.
Thank you, Nivedita. Let me just start sharing my screen. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
And see my screen? Yeah, cool. So yeah, first of all, thanks so much, Art Forward team, for having me and for this really wonderful event that you guys are hosting. I've been attending the talks and it's really been very interesting to hear all the conversations. I'll be speaking about data and technology, the future of art, covering themes of artificial intelligence, data, politics of data, machine learning, blockchain, and so on. And so let me get started with that. I think first and foremost, whenever conversations of technology and it's especially AI and its role in art starts happening, there's a lot of chitter chatter about, is it replacing the human artist? Is this sort of the end of the road for human arts and so on? And to me personally, I mean, that is a conversation that doesn't really make sense because technology has always played a pivotal role in shaping the arts of the time that the technology has come around. And in some sense, it's always augmented the human artist and created new universes of creative expression that are possible. And I think looking at AI and machine learning from that lens is what I try and do. But having said that, what is very interesting with AI compared to sort of the tools and technologies of the past is that now we have a technology that goes beyond just fulfilling an artist's creative vision solely, but rather because it's learning pretty much like humans do from data sets and so on, it's able to play a much more involved role in sort of the creative process. And that's what I start terming as the human-machine creativity continuum, where both the human and the machine creative agency sort of come together in a tightly coupled manner to create an artwork. And all the artworks that I show later will sort of highlight this fact. And the third key pillar sort of my work is to look at creating art with technology as a means to comment on technology itself. We're all massively surrounded and sort of immersed in technology almost 24/7 these days, including like all the webinars we're having and so on and so forth. So it really becomes essential to then use this medium itself to start having conversations of how technology is affecting our lives and what it means to live in today's tech day and age. So yeah, those will be sort of the themes across the talk. And beginning with this particular example of photography, when it started back in the early 1800s, this was probably in some sense the most important moment that affected image making to a large extent before like machine learning and AI came about. So in that sense, that was also a technology that up to that point, artists had this sort of role of trying to mimic realism and sort of copy reality to the best extent possible. And when photography came about, we obviously saw such a large departure from that traditional way of art making. And it really opened up these new possibilities for artists who didn't have to anymore sort of mimic reality, right? So in the sense sort of highlighting how technology can really bring about possibilities of new forms of creation. And then obviously we've all known that fine art photography and photography itself became such a powerful art medium. And a more sort of simpler example, but profound nonetheless, is just the invention of something simple like paint tubes, right? That led to the impressionist movements happening, and sort of it wouldn't have been possible to step out of the studio and make such interesting artworks before that. So yeah, there has been that sort of tightly coupled role of technology in the arts for a long, long time. And that is what I, in my practice, explore, of course, with the technologies of today's time. So one of the first pieces that I want to talk about is called the Flying Pantograph. This is a piece that basically uses the drone, a technology we've probably heard of oftentimes in the media and so on, as an artistic end factor. So sort of using drones as a means to create art, as a means to augment the sense of body that we have. We are confined by the limits of our physical body. There's not so much we can do beyond that. But can we then bring in technologies to sort of augment that and reach spaces and canvases that we wouldn't be able to reach otherwise? And it's always wonderful for me to see, especially like here, this was shown at Asia Culture Center in Korea, and very young people sort of just walk up, and it's so natural to them. Like there is that digital nativity that plays out. They just walk up and start using this as if it's just another toy for them, right? And we are growing up in this technological era, so the tools of art making better sort of start transforming accordingly. And yeah, I'll just play a quick video of how this works in sort of the real world. So here, someone just moves their hands on a table holding a pen, and that motion is transferred to the drone, which has a marker attached to it to sort of copy those motions to the best of its capabilities. And both, in a sense, there's this very subtle, you have to experience it to sort of actually get the feel of it, but there is a coupling between the human hand and the drone, but there's also that decoupling because of the drone's inherent movements and the that it faces with the whiteboard and so on. And that creates a very interesting uh, reflection among the human artists, because you're trying to do something, the drone is mimicking that, but it's also adding its own like squirtiness and sort of this wiggliness to it, and adding its own sort of aesthetic to it. And that really is interesting for me, because once you bring in such complex tools, they almost start having their own agency in the artwork that's been created, and the human almost has to start responding to that to be able to work together to come up with an artwork. So we've shown this at various places, and there's this one particular artist called Subin Chang who does a lot of work with robotics and art, and uh, she was able to make this almost instantly something very interesting and sort of coherent because she's already had that practice of working with robotics. So it almost feels like there is an evolutionary process involved where if you start working with technology over time, you sort of become more comfortable with it, and you're able to better fine tune your artistic vision to come together with technology and technological tools. So this was a large part about sort of physical augmentation, and most of the rest of the talk will be more hardcore AI-driven artworks. And sort of the difference between the previous work and the following works would be with AI, you're not just augmenting the sense of your body or the sense of your physical capabilities, you're really starting to involve like the brain augmentation aspects into the work, right? Where the technology is able to contribute in the scope of imagination and perception and so on, beyond just physical augmentation. So just a little history about artificial intelligence. Right when computers started to exist, humans have always been thinking of how can we start replicating the human intelligence and embodying that within a machine? So this is a photo from actually 1940s where people were already studying the brain and the neural connections that are part of our brain, the neurons and its connections and so on, and trying to really understand A, human intelligence itself, and B, how to capture that and embody it into a machine form. And so theoretically, like neural networks, which is sort of the backbone of AI technology today, like theoretically and algorithmically, that concept has existed for some time, back to the days of Alan Turing, sort of 1950s and so on. But over the last 5 to 10 years, it's really seen a boom across industries and availability of tons of data today. And this is where like there is sort of things start getting interesting because data is now the fuel for anything artificially intelligent that happens. And uh, sort of data collection started becoming such an important factor in the early 2000s when surveillance became such an important part of our lives, right? There were cameras everywhere. The governments were going paranoid, sort of just trying to capture every detail of every individual's public, and now with companies like Facebook and whatnot, like even private life. So because there was so much of data, it became an incentive for companies economically to form large research groups around trying to process this data. And so that led to a lot of inventions and innovations in the AI space. And the second important factor is better compute that sort of depicts or follows from Moore's law, which is that in the early 2000s, to the left, you see this massive computer, which was one of the fastest computers of that time, but it occupied an entire building. And on the right, pretty much similar compute capacity on a handheld sort of GPU card, which you can put in a computer, and the cost is much less, so it's become much more accessible. So on the backbone of these two sort of advancements, the technology or the algorithm called neural network really started flourishing. And I know it's getting a little tech jargony, but all this will help you guys make sense of all the art that is to follow. So essentially, neural networks very simply are pattern making and pattern understanding algorithms where you feed in a bunch of data, like you give it 1,000 photos of cats and 1,000 photos of dogs. And ultimately, this neural network thing is able to recognize cats from dogs. So it essentially give it a lot of data, it recognizes patterns between that and is able to make sense of that data and even start producing data that is of similar kind, which we'll come to later. So in some sense, this has allowed the machine to perceive the world around it, similar to what humans do. When we grow up, we see lots of things. Our parents point out that's a cat, that's a dog. And over time, when we've seen enough examples, we are able to say that this is a cat, this is a dog, right? And in some sense, if you start thinking of it, the opposite of this ability of perception is the act of creation. Like only after we've learned to analyze and understand the world around us are we able to start creating on top of that, right? So, and that is what machine learning art also allows us to do. Given that computers understand a lot of things visually, can we flip that process in some sense and ask it to start creating things from this understanding it has? So I created this artwork, interactive artwork called Tandem, which is essentially a drawing software. You draw something like on the left, I've drawn this ink pot with a feather pen and written something on it. And on the right, you see the machine's interpretation and imagination from that initial drawing, where I'm saying, okay, machine, you've learned how to perceive and recognize things. Now, in this artwork that I've drawn, in this simple drawing that I've drawn, what do you see? Can you enhance that and bring that out for me? So very interestingly, like most humans would just treat this as a feather pen and an ink bottle, but the machine somehow thinks of it as a right? And it completes the drawing to draw the bird around it and create that as part of the artwork, which really is very interesting for me because now the machine is not fulfilling my creative vision only, it's adding so much rich imagination to the conversation. So here, for example, I drew this scribble of what most of us would think as leafless trees and sort of a deserted land, but the machine somehow imagines them as these dogs with large ears on the right, which really sort of fascinates me, right? Like now I have an artistic collaborator which can throw back things at me that are way beyond my personal imagination scope. And how can I work then with this machine to direct it in certain ways and get back interesting results and have this sort of conversation with the machine to build up an artwork. Here's a video of Tandem at play. So I'm just making these scribbles, and it's essentially filling those in with these very interesting details. So you can see that something on the left became a semi-car kind of a structure, and on the right, it transformed it into birds with different like 2, 3 birds mixed together and so on. So it really starts to get very interesting. And now for me as an artist, sure, like this thing is exciting in itself. And how can I sort of stretch the scope of what the machine can help me make, right? So if I start confining the data that the machine trains on, anything that I give the machine as an input drawing will be interpreted from that lens. So for example, if I just train the machine on flower images, like I drew this simple line structure on the left, it imagines flowers between them. So it really then, as the artist, I can start tweaking sort of the algorithm and the data set that I'm working with to really start forming artworks in a direction that I want to go into. So it's been interesting over the years to exhibit this work at various places. One of the more interesting exhibitions is on the right, which is Tandem became a permanent exhibit at this Heinz Nixdorf Museum, which is the largest computer science museum in the world. And it was very interesting for me as an artist to be invited by a computer science museum to sort of exhibit an artwork there, because this speaks of sort of how technology is made much more accessible through the arts, right? And a computer science museum realizing that and sort of bringing artworks in was very interesting. The next technology of artificial intelligence, and this will be sort of the last technical heavy slide in some sense, but it's important to just make note of this term called generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which is being used primarily by anyone working in the AI art space internationally these days. What GANs allow you to do, we talked about perception a little bit and how the idea of perception can be flipped into creation through Tandem. With GANs, what you can do is, again, feed in tons of data called the training set of images, let's say 10,000 or 50,000 images of a certain kind, and the machine, without any explicit information of line or form or color or composition, just tries to understand patterns from that data set and start creating imagery of that kind. And just to play this video, these are all fake faces that a machine has learned to generate back in 2017-18 itself. And so it's doing a great job at creation of images from scratch, right? For me as an artist, the realism is probably not the most exciting thing, but more as to what this adds in terms of conversations in image creation itself. So this was one of the first works that I did with GANs, which became part of what Nivedita also mentioned, the first AI art show. And it was actually one of the first internationally that had only artworks made with AI. There have been other AI art shows, but that have focused more on sort of the relation of AI and art with humans and so on. But this was purely just all art made with AI. So really establishing AI art as a genre. So this was the first show internationally to have done that. And this work was largely inspired by one of Rembrandt's most famous paintings called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tull, where he made this at a time of troubled fascination with medical science and the ability for humans to cut open other humans and sort of look inside them. And I was also sort of in that troubled fascination space with artificial intelligence. And I was wondering how much of humans should the machines be allowed to look into? And so I created this work with where I curated a data set of about 60,000 images of human surgical dissections and then used GANs to process them and create these visually interesting outputs of the machine's imagination of the really raw and gore of the human body. And to think of GANs and AI art, I think this analogy sort of is what I like to talk about in terms of thinking of AI art, where with machine learning and AI, like the paint is sort of the data that you collect or you curate. And the AI algorithm is kind of the paintbrush that you use to work with that paint and create the artwork. Data is the paint, and you use AI algorithms to paint with that data essentially. And as the artist, you both sort of create the data and you really go into the details of how you're curating the data, how you're collecting the data. It's sort of like an artist making their paint pigments back in the day. And with the AI algorithm, you really go into the details of how the machine is learning, how quickly it is converging at a certain understanding of the data set and so on. So you really sort of start sculpting with the AI algorithm to create an artwork. So yeah, data becomes the raw material, AI algorithm becomes the paintbrush to paint with that raw material. And I think this particular analogy is very well highlighted through this very recent work that I did called Strange Genders, which most of last year sort of went into creating this work. Was done with 64 bar 1, an artist collective duo based out of Bangalore, who also actually were curators of the Nature Mod show. And what happens in this work is we collected about 2,300 images of sketches that people in India made of their visual understanding and representation of gender. So all kinds of people from different backgrounds, construction workers, policemen, nurses, different kinds of sort of humans. We gave them a little piece of paper with the instruction to draw their understanding of a male figure, a standing male figure, and a standing female figure, both in 60 seconds. So just very quickly, whatever comes to their mind, just sketch it out, right? And it was really like super fascinating to just collect this data set itself. This data set itself is a work of art to me, because like you see such variety in terms of representation, especially like in the center, you see this very abstract representation of a female form that someone's done. And we split up the data collection. Like we were doing it till about March before the lockdowns hit in person. And then we also started using the Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is an online platform where you can give micro tasks to people and they can create something for like whatever money you pay them. And so this was the male data set that we collected. Again, similar number of images, very interesting visually, and then fed them to a machine learning algorithm where I get this output from the machine, right? It's creating this sort of a representation of female and male forms. And the machine learning output is then fed into a classification algorithm, which is essentially trained on the drawings that people made. And the output is like, this machine created figure is 40%. With confidence, the machine is able to say this is 40% female and 60% confident that it's male, and so on and so forth. So then sort of creating this spectrum of gender representation, which is based on what the humans created, but then processed through the machine to get these outputs. And yeah, it was really interesting to see the machine's outputs and how the machine, like you see sort of the 60 and the 40% female forms at the bottom, and you really see sort of that struggle between parts of it looking like male, parts of it looking like female, and so on. And then ultimately sort of created this using these machine outputs to create this this final piece where you're essentially using the drawings of the machine as a texture almost. So this is a massive print. It's a 6 feet by 6 feet output, and the physical production is on canvas. But yeah, and along with this, sort of the artwork also has 3 books, which is one is about the human drawings itself, because that itself is so fascinating, and 2 books about male and female form figures that are formed. So this, we were supposed to showcase this at Artisima last year, but the India Pavilion decided to postpone its participation because it would have been virtual, and we felt that doing it in a physical format this year would be more interesting. So yeah, I mean, I've sort of established this notion that AI art is heavily dependent on data, and sort of the kind of data that you feed in almost is the kind of art that you create with machine learning, of course, processed through the AI algorithms. But as I was working in this field back sort of in 2018-17, I really started feeling uncomfortable by all the AI art coming out of the European American art context, right? Like, and the reason for that being pretty much that data sets from that region of art are more available and more easy to use by the artists. So as an Indian artist in this field, I really started thinking of how can I add more visual diversity to this conversation, so that sort of the cultural underpinnings of AI art don't just remain like Western European kind of context. And that has been a problem with the arts forever, and sort of any new art movement always is based out of the context of those regions. So it became really sort of interesting for me to start working with Indian masks. And also masks, I feel, are a really interesting metaphor for our existence in the technological era, because we always hide behind like social media identities, which become our masks in today's times and so on. So very interested in working with masks as raw materials to start creating these AI interpretations from. And there's also this interactive work, which is part of the Mass Reality series, where I work with these very expressive forms of Khayyam and Kathakali paintings of the South, to then in real time start transforming your sense of identity into these face painting rituals from the past and the present, obviously. And this has also been exhibited interestingly at very international context, where people are now starting to see art through this very personally engaging format, where your face is the art in some sense. So that's something that I find really fascinating about interactive art as well, which is a result of AI's involvement, that the art exists because of the audience in some sense. Like the art wouldn't be there without them. And I think that is very interesting to both bring a more accessible nature of the arts to the world, and also sort of use this as a way to have conversations around technology itself. And sort of, yeah, leaning into that, why I often say that tech art to me is a commentary on tech and an existence with it, is because we are so tightly sort of intertwined with technology these days. So just as a way, more of a conceptual piece around this theme, I created this work called Authorized, where a human starts writing something, but then after 10 seconds, the human hand is now controlled by the machine. So there's a magnetic system under the table which starts taking control of your hand and essentially continues the writing for you. And you just hold the pen like just like a sort of a robotic person just holding a pen, right? And the machine moves that hand around for you to write something like this. So here, like the human wrote, freedom of man is a myth, and then uh, who is a moral and a nice person of the state to say the truth. So that is the machine sort of continuing the human writing. And I exhibited this at Ars Electronica in 2017. And what was very interesting for me is after people sort of work and write this out with the machine, I asked them that, does this writing belong to you or who does it belong to? And often there is still that human-centric view of looking at technology where they say, yeah, this belongs to me, even though they've just done nothing beyond holding a pen and letting their hand be moved around by the machine. The machine is thinking of what to write. The machine is literally sort of controlling them, right? Physically also. And that, I think, after then a conversation around this work, they start sort of reflecting on how much of control actually machines have subtly in our lives, on sort of our social media posts, our ads that we see every day, day in and day out. How much of control are we really letting go in terms of our interaction with technology, especially fueled with AI, where every moment of our lives is captured as data points, right? So a lot of work is about, and if you even think about the drone work and sort of work and so on, it's all sort of this commentary, like, are drones only sort of a full technology? Can they be used in other contexts of arts and expression and so on? So yeah, that really becomes like a theme of work. And I just wanted to show like a couple of slides about sort of AI art becoming an established genre, in the sense that both the major houses, auction houses, Sotheby's and Christie's, have now auctioned AI artworks, which is interesting to see. And this brings me sort of to the last segment of the talk, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussions. Is especially with last year with the pandemic and everyone confined to their homes, it became really difficult to like step out and see art, right? And sort of this uh, technology of putting art on the blockchain really bloomed last year. It sort of started around the 2017-18s, but is doing sort of okay. But really last year, people started taking notice of this. And just very quickly, what blockchain is, it is a distributed ledger system for tamper-proof data storage. So very simply meaning it's a database where you record things like this belongs to this was sold from this person to this person. And all this database is tamper-proof, like no one can go and change that. That's just how the technology is. How it happens, why it's tamper-proof and all, we can't get into those details, but just accept that this is the technology. And that really interesting for the art world, right? Because even yesterday, David was speaking about sort of art law and how it's such a big issue to track provenance and the history of an artwork. And now I put it on a blockchain, it just becomes immutable. So you create like a unique token for every artwork that you have. Its entire history is tracked and it's publicly available. Like all the database of blockchain is for public viewing. It's not like a private thing where you have to access it through some high dignitary or whatever. So it's just publicly available. So it makes it very transparent. Everyone knows like who brought what for how much and whatever, and who created it, where is it right now. All that history gets tracked. The very interesting thing for me as an artist is like secondary sale is obviously ensured in terms of the royalty being ensured through secondary sales, because the history is so transparent. So you know exactly when your work is selling on the secondary market, and you get a royalty for that. And I think the last bit, which is in true sense sort of revolutionary in my thing, because even without blockchain, yeah, like art world was still functioning, right? Whatever, however complex the issues were, it's still functioning. People were buying art, people selling art. But the last bit really is interesting because now with blockchain, it's allowed the possibility of making digital art a collectible. So earlier, like digital art, everyone would just think like it's just an image on the computer, like it's so easy to replicate, anyone can copy and save it and whatever. But um, now once it's uploaded on the blockchain, that becomes like the original artwork, and therefore it becomes a rare commodity, and therefore it becomes something that a collector could collect and have it as part of their collection. So that has really like opened up a lot of possibilities for digital creators and digital art makers. And just to sort of show one example of a platform called Super Rare, where which allows for putting art on the blockchain and sort of selling art through the blockchain. And I put up some works also, and on the right you can see like the entire history of that is right there for anyone to see and look at, right? So whenever it exchanges hands, whenever it sort of moves from one collector to the other, everyone is informed of that process, which is very interesting. And just to mention like numbers very quickly, Super Rare, I don't have the exact numbers, but from whatever they tweet, up till like early 2000s, they're probably doing the business of a few $100,000 or something. But over the last 6-7 months, every year they've sold more than $1 million of art every month. Sorry, every month of the last 5-6 months. And it's still very, very nascent, obviously. Like the major art places haven't caught up to this, but it's making a movement in itself. And actually Christie's ended up auctioning a blockchain and a token of art a couple of months ago also. So it's starting to see traction from sort of the traditional art spaces as well. And there are companies like Verisart, which allow you to create this blockchain certification of an artwork. But yeah, having said all this, the technology is still at its nascent stage, and there is a lot of ecological and cost associated damages that are involved with blockchain art right now. But there are new technologies that are coming up. So it's still in that sort of phase where there are interesting things being developed every day and interesting conversations being had. So I'd love for you all to also read up on some of these and start forming your own sort of thoughts and opinions about them. So yeah, this is all that I wanted to share in terms of a slide deck, and we could have conversations now.
Thank you so much, Harshit. That was very interesting. We've actually received a lot of questions from the audience.
Yeah.
But before we go into that, I had a question for you. You know, you brought this up momentarily where you said that as humans, we assume that just because we are involved, we own this work. And I have a question for your for Tandem. You know, suppose who is the owner of that work? Because now, if the auction houses are auctioning AI work for $400,000, then there's a question there that who owns this and how is this transfer? How is the transfer of ownership going to happen? Yeah. Do I look at the algorithm as a true collaborator, or is it a tool that I'm using?
Yeah, I mean, it is not a straightforward conversation for sure. And I think this space itself is currently evolving with all these questions. But at least as of now, the final work is the work that is collected, and not unless the artist decides to sell the algorithm as well. It is not sold, because the artist feels that there is that human involvement in whatever the initial drawing that they did, and it's sort of a result of that the work was created by the machine in a certain way. So there are sometimes analogies that people use that if someone plays the piano, is like, do you sell the music that's created, or do you sell the piano with the musical output, right? So in some sense, there is that notion, which I think as of now, it holds true, that the AI algorithm is a complex tool where it adds to the imaginatory conversation for sure, but it's still the artist that is central to the work.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for now, we're looking at it as a tool.
As a tool, but something beyond your regular tools, where it is really it. Because even when I work with AI, I leave sort of part of the imagination for the AI to fit in, and I, as an artist, in the process, sometimes take a backseat to make sure that I'm giving enough room to the AI to influence me also. But I'm also using the AI and manipulating the algorithm in ways that I want, as to sort of drive it in a direction uh, to get a final output. So there is that sort of back and forth that happens a lot. But because there is no intentionality in terms of the AI algorithm, the intentionality is all mine. It still remains a human artist's work.
Thank you. I have one more question for you before we move to the audience questions. Are there any particular art and technology interventions in India? I mean, it could be a startup, it could be another artist. Any projects that specifically interest you or excite you? You're excited to see what's happening next with them?
Yeah,
or even internationally. I mean, India would be great, but if it's something international, that's also fine.
Yeah, internationally, I think definitely there's a lot of new platforms and new art studios that are coming up, and that have also existed for some time. Like I think Random International from the UK, Team Labs from Japan, they're really pushing the boundaries. Refik Anadol is another AI artist, and in terms of and also like the crypto art, like the blockchain art movement, it's a lot of platforms from the US and even Asian countries are starting to come up. And in that sense, I think in India, Nature Mart has actually been very sort of very active in the technology art space with their AI art show, to having done that internationally as one of the first shows. And now they're, I think, launching another platform called Terrain Art, which has blockchain at the back end. So there's definitely some new interesting things happening in this space in India as well. Some of the, like I mentioned, 64 by 1, they're an artist duo that I collaborate with sometimes, that are also sort of actively thinking of technology and art. So yeah, but definitely I think there needs to be more institutional involvement of technology in arts in India for sure. But we're seeing some changes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to the audience questions now because we have about 20 minutes and 17 questions. So, okay, so the first question is, somebody asked that, thank you. So Divya says, thank you so much for this. Strange Genders is so incredible. My mind is blown. I wanted to ask you a bit about creative coding. Have you used P5JS in processing, or what other tools do you use to create your work?
Yeah, thanks, Divya. Yeah, I've definitely worked with P5 and processing and open frameworks and so on for creative coding. I think they're very instrumental in sort of creating this new media art community internationally. For a lot of my work, I usually end up writing code myself in something like Python, or like mostly machine learning based libraries are written in Python. So I end up using that as a programming language. But yeah, all these creative coding platforms that you mentioned are a good place to start for sure.
Thank you. I'm just wondering which question to take next. So Deepthi says, thank you so much for your talk, Harshit. This is Deepthi from the Design Lab. I have two questions. How do you see the integration of AI growing into different design and media disciplines in the future? And her second question is, what are some hurdles you came across while you began your journey with AI and art, technical or otherwise?
So I think definitely, like, most of design and media spaces are going to be impacted by AI one way or the other. Even if it's like stock images, which a designer uses so often, like there is so much involvement of creating, of using AI to create those kinds of imagery, for example, animation and whatnot. I mean, I can't really pick out one single domain because everything that includes any form of image making is going to be impacted. And even text, we've seen textbooks or sort of stories coming out of AI generation, music production by AI, and so on. So anything that we're able to capture in a certain sense that the machine can be fed and it can learn from is AI's game. And the second question, I think was, yeah, what challenges? So I think there are all kinds of challenges technically for sure, like because now you're an artist and a scientist like merged into one sort of, so you're always moving back and forth, even in your mindset. Like when you're creating a work of art, there's some moments where you're just like stuck solving a technical challenge, like how do I get this thing to work at all? How do I work with this library or whatever? And so at that moment, you obviously lose out on that artistic aspect of the work. And then the other times you're more artistically inclined. And sort of it's about using tech to push the boundaries of tech and art both combined, sort of. So there are those technical challenges, but there are also, I think, all kinds of sort of institutional challenges in some sense where you're trying to bring out the essence of why this is something that's important to think about and look into and reflect upon from a larger techno, social, political landscape. But yeah, it's all exciting nonetheless. So I think, yeah.
Okay. So next.
I actually had a question for Harshit.
Okay.
Harshit, I wanted to know, with the inclusion of technology and AI, you said that it promotes new art forms. But are you worried that some older or more traditional art forms may be permanently lost with the inclusion of technology and AI?
Uh, I mean, that is really, even if they're lost, they won't be lost because of AI and its involvement in the arts. I think like if there is a natural course of their being sort of faded into oblivion, that might just happen. But I think AI provides, especially like I've worked, like I showed the work with masks and so on, right? So actually that has helped me bring some of these traditional art forms into a more accessible, interactive format for the audience to engage with. So I think sort of looking at it from that lens is very interesting and exciting for me, that instead of just being sort of behind glass walls in a museum, like can I bring that traditional artwork out and really augment both its consumption and sort of the participation by the audience in doing and interacting with that work. So yeah, it's really up to how the artists think about it. Yeah.
So the next question, Harshit, is from Abdullah. He says, thanks for the talk, Harshit. While we were talking mostly about paintings and the way AI collaborates and creates work, what are your thoughts on DAL-E, the AI that generates pictures from giant data sets? Will highly advanced AI like these take prominence in the art world?
Yeah, I mean, Dali is obviously, I think, shown a very interesting vision of how AI can generate even random images. Like, I think there were things like avocado shaped chair as a prompt to an AI, and AI was able to generate something that looked sort of interesting. But especially for arts, I mean, all those are good in the form of fulfilling some function. But I think for the art space, it's so much more beyond just image making, right? Like any image is not a work of art. Like there has to be that human intention behind creating that work of art and sort of calling it that this is art, right? I mean, even like Marcel Duchamp could call a urinal an artwork, but he had to call it out and say that this is a work of art. So I think like the fundamental notion of art is that of art behind it, and AI won't do that. So I think in that sense, even though image making will become very sophisticated through an AI, art in itself will still involve the human in its creation. Yeah. And one other interesting aspect I think I wanted to point out from Strange Genders, and also since you brought up Dali, is sort of how AI enables us to rethink universal concepts, right? Like because there's some entity now that can process data much more than any human ever could, it allows for rethinking very basic concepts like what is gender, what is color, what is our notion of the color black, for example, or something. And you take like 100,000 images of people having tagged that image as black and sort of try and understand what is that universal notion of a particular concept. So I think things like those conceptually will become very interesting that now are being enabled by AI. But yeah, art will have humans as the intention creators behind it.
Harshit, going back to GANs, could you say that the person inputting the pictures or data sets are kind of like a curator in a way, giving the machine the objects to
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think the role of an artist with AI, with GANs, has become a mix of a curator and the artist, not just in the data set that they input, but also like after the machine is trained, it creates millions of images, infinite images. So as the human artist, you then sort of cherry pick, like, this is what I want to show as the artwork to the world. And so you are in a sense curating from the millions of outputs that the machine generates. So yeah, there is often this term called curatist that people start using for this kind of art making. Yeah.
Okay. Um, okay, someone asked, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got into this?
Uh, yeah, so I think in terms of background, I studied design at IIT Guwahati for my undergrad. So it always was sort of this mix of the creative space and the technological space for me. Um, and then I went on to do a master's at the Media Lab at MIT in the US, which I think really sort of firmly established this idea of creating art with technology for me, because like a lot of the creative coding platforms that Divya mentioned have come out of the Media Lab, and there's just so many interesting things happening in that space there that I got really fascinated by. Like, I like making things, I like technology, I like to ask questions about technology. So it just then I did a few art residencies at tech art studios and museums and so on. And so yeah, the journey sort of just continued from there.
So Anushka asks, what's your view on the ethics of using algorithms that might be trained on data collected without permission? And for you, does making art with AI also include curating data as a major part of the process?
Yeah, definitely. I think with Strange Genders, I think that really was the core that we wanted to create the data set as a true representation of what people really think, and with their intention of actually creating those drawings. Data set is probably the backbone of working with AI art. Uh, Oftentimes, sometimes there's other forms of art making also. And the ethics of using data sets is a massive issue for sure. I think one very basic thing is to try and not use like copyright materials, obviously, and anything that's openly available, to just start using that. But also, like, you're seeing things like deep fakes and so on, which not from an artistic perspective, but people are able to download data from your Instagram posts or whatever, Facebook and so on, and just use that in very troubling ways. So I think just the realization that that is possible for me as an artist to convey that through projects like Authorized and other like AI artworks is important for me to get people to have that conversation and be aware that their data is out there for anyone to use these days. But yeah, it really boils down to major companies sort of coming together to ensure that large data sets are used ethically.
So this question had come in on our social media, and I hope the person who asked this question is attending. The question is, what are the possibilities and challenges of adding interactivity into art using tech, especially in multimodal art?
Yeah, it is challenging for sure. I think why it's challenging also is because it's like something you're putting out in the public, and people can use it in all kinds of ways, right? Like you can't program for all kinds of ways that people will use something. It's essentially like creating an app or creating a product and letting it out in the public. So with a static piece of work, that's the work, you view it, you're done, right? With an interactive work, people are drawing in it, people are sort of moving their faces around. Like when I was showing the mask reality work, someone would make a paper drawing of a face and put it. Seeing ways of working with interactive art, and that is the real beauty of it. Also, that people are really making the work of art their own and really sort of enjoying their presence in that space. And with tandem also, like all kinds, with the drone especially, which is such a fragile kind of an entity. It's flying around, but then people are trying to like make massive movements, and so all that definitely gets very tricky to sort of make sure you work out all possible ways people might use this in. But if they use it in other ways, that's just added bonus for me as an artist to see how people respond to things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a little similar to maybe what I might have asked you earlier, but I'll just go with it. Shreyasi is asking, right now, is there any work going on in India to create any center or already existing places for displaying works of new media art, something along the lines of Moody, maybe?
Yeah, I've come across some spaces that are working in this area. Science Gallery Bangalore is actually a very good example. They launched their first show last year, and really wonderful people. I met them a couple of times. Really deeply interested in bringing the conversation of science and technology through the arts. That is one place that definitely comes to my mind. There are some centers in Goa that are also starting to work in this space. One called Sensistan, which is doing some work in this space. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I would really love, and I did mention Nature Mart earlier, but I really love sort of uh, more institutions to sort of jump on this and really start bringing media art and interactive art to people. I know, I think last year with all the lockdowns and stuff, it became a little more tricky, even for like Science Gallery, Bangalore, and so on. Because they had to shift to online shows only. But yeah, from this year on, I guess.
Harshit, how do you see art consumption patterns or audience viewing these AI experiences changing as there are more and more use of AI in art nowadays?
How do I see art?
How do you see like the audience reacting to these changes?
Yeah, I think the audience will sort of evolve as more and more art of this nature is shown to them. I think as an artist, it becomes really important uh, to bring about experience. Like it's not just creating the art; it's about creating that whole experience for them to view it in a way that they instantly connect with it. Like they see that their face is being changed. So it's that instant connection, like I'm doing something, something is happening. But then can you layer it enough for them to go beyond that instant connection and really start unpacking like what the work is trying to say? Like with the masked reality works, there's a female form and a male form, the Thaya male form and a female form, both simultaneously showing your face as a reflection. And so it's about masks, obviously, but it's also about sort of this fluid identity that you can possibly have given technology as a medium. So yeah, I think once people, because the audience in India is already using technology a lot, like everyone's on social media, everyone's like using some app or the other day in and day out. So I think that switch from seeing it just in terms of their phones or computers to seeing it in public art spaces, I think that will really open up a lot of possibilities. Yeah. And even in terms of collection and so on, like we touched upon blockchain, I think all those would also see a really interesting consumption change in terms of art.
I think someone else also asked a question about blockchain. Abhinay asks, what do you think about the power requirements of blockchain technologies in art in particular?
Yeah, I think that that is still a major hurdle with blockchain. I think that last slide that I had, which was cryptoart.wtf, that the artist Memo Acton has created, really talks about how power heavy it is right now. But there is new technology, especially Ethereum 2.0, the blockchain called Ethereum 2.0 that's coming in, which is really trying to solve all of those. So I think it's still one of those things. I mean, like I showed that slide of the computer being room scale in 2000, and now we have like a chip sized device that with the same compute power. So I think blockchain fundamentally as a concept is very, very fascinating. And I think something that's about to stay for a long time. It's just that it'll take its own time to evolve into something more usable. But even in its current form, yeah, I mean, if artists don't have to fly across the oceans to show their artwork and can directly do it on the blockchain, that's already balancing out like energy and CO2 consumption.
So
And
you could say that blockchain technology is more or less eliminating the need for like a third party.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It makes everything more transparent, more decentralized.
So I'm going to take one last question, which is from Deepthi. She's talking about the integrity of the data, which is very interesting. She says, how does the integrity of data get authorized? Considering in the example you showed, what if cat images are fed to the system while intentionally asking the AI to categorize them as a dog, for example? So is there a way to hold the integrity of the information poured in as data?
I think that's a very interesting question. And I mean, like if your purpose requires cats to be labeled as dogs, then might as well. But I mean, yeah, like the nuances of data integrity, there is really no way of ensuring that, right? Because ultimately, like if you end up goofing up and you put something out in the public that really starts hurting people's sentiments in a certain way, then that will come back to bite you for sure. But before that, it's really up to the human, right? Like I can call a cup of tea as coffee. I can do whatever. So I think that that integrity really comes from putting stuff out in the public and sort of the feedback loop of people calling things out. But apart from that, labels are human creations and will continue to be human creations in the AI world also.
Okay, so I think we will stop taking questions there. There are still a few, but I think we mostly answered them. Harshit, is there anything, any of the questions that you particularly want to pick up if you'd like to go through it?
Okay, let me just quickly go through this. Disha asks, like, while using Tandem, what if machine interprets something which I didn't mean? Uh, can Tandem be used to draw images of our wish, or it's just something random? So, I mean, what I was highlighting through Tandem was the beauty of actually seeing something that you didn't intend in the first place as an outcome. So sort of augmenting your imagination scope. But obviously, like then I mentioned, like if you restrict the data set to just flowers or faces or whatever, then you can start directing the machine in that direction. So it is a spectrum of control that you can choose how much you want to really sort of direct the machine in a certain direction and how much do you want to get surprised by it. So I think that that is precisely sort of the continuum that I talk about, that it becomes a spectrum of control in some sense that the human artist has, where they can completely let go and really take in what the machine is offering them, but then they can also direct the machine in more conservative ways. Yeah, I think all the other questions are interesting also, but I know that we're a little
Okay,
over time
take
now.
take one more.
Okay, sure. Um, hmm, it's artistic to learn specific. I think Shruti is asking Harshit another question to you. So artists are creating algorithms to learn specific aesthetics and then create a final artwork. So each time the artwork gets enhanced with machine learning, what then is the factor for pricing of such repetitive pieces of the same artwork produced, since each is an enhanced piece? So I think this is also very interesting from the perspective that AI art obviously allows you, like I said, it can output like millions of images once it's trained on a data set. So it allows you to produce quantity quickly, bulk number of images quickly. That itself can be seen as a way of, like, if you're producing artworks where you really want to have like 500 images of a certain aesthetic produced in a shorter amount of time, AI can be used as an aid for that. But in terms of really where the artist starts bringing their vision to life through AI, I think the artist is very aware of not like repetitively using a particular data set or repetitively using a particular aesthetic only. So I think then is when the real fun of using sort of the material to really sculpt it using the algorithms and so on starts happening, where you're really trying to push, like, I mean, you can take clay as an analogy, put it on a potter's wheel and create similar kinds of pots day in and day out. But then for really creating interesting artwork that stands out, that says something new to the audience, you really start going in and sculpting it uniquely, right? So it's similar with AI, though it allows you to create like lots of images quickly, but to really create something interesting, you have to work very strongly, get very involved with the algorithm, with the data, and really sculpt it in a way that you want. So yeah, I guess that answers that question.
So Kavya says, please answer this.
Yeah,
Is it
sure.
possible to create Loving Vincent with AI?
Is it possible to create what?
Loving Vincent, the animated
Yeah,
Vincent Van Gogh.
yeah. I think a lot of it was actually created with AI. There is a particular algorithm which became really popular called style transfer, where you're able to, especially with like paintings like the Impressionist paintings, which have a very unique style associated with them, you could transfer that style onto different images. So yeah, you can use AI technology to ultimately create something like Loving Vincent. I'm not sure if the animation itself was done using AI, but definitely a lot of the image creation was done using machine learning.
We're going to take one last question. Do you think the increasing use of AI in art will lead to greater democratization of art consumption and viewing by stepping even further away from the white cube experience?
Absolutely. I think that that is one really interesting promise of using technology in art, and also allowing for technology created art to be called art and to be viewed as like a real work of art. That because technological platforms, by their very nature, are very decentralized and very sort of, I mean, not decentralized in terms of ownership, but in terms of consumption. Like everyone can almost view them from the comfort of their homes and so on. So it's definitely going to make art consumption much more accessible to people. And also, I think it's creating like this new brand of artists that is very exciting. Like I showed that image of the little girl using the drone right away, right? So like this new generation is growing up in a digitally native world, so they are going to be much more easily attracted to digital tools of art creation. So I think that itself will make creation also democratic.
Okay. So we're going to end here. Thank you so much, Harshit, for that masterclass on technology and art, and of course, showing us your absolutely amazing projects. I think we've all learned a lot in this hour. So thanks again for joining us. And also thank you everyone for joining us for this session.